The spring of 1518 hung heavy over Rome, the air thick with the scent of blooming gardens and the unmistakable reek of corruption that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the apostolic palace. It was in this season of renewal that one of the most shocking scandals ever to rock Christendom would come crashing down upon the Church, threatening to shatter the fragile illusion of papal sanctity that Rome had so carefully cultivated for centuries. The man at the centre of this maelstrom was Pope Leo X, born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, a man who had ascended to the throne of St. Peter not through any particular calling to spiritual matters, but through the machinations of one of Renaissance Italy's most powerful banking families, the Medici of Florence. What transpired in the weeks and months following the discovery of his secret would become one of history's most scandalous episodes, one that would be whispered about in corridors across Europe and discussed in shocked tones from Paris to Constantinople. The popular account, shaped by centuries of Catholic apologists and Protestant polemicists alike, has attempted to minimize or obscure what actually occurred within the convent of San Marcelo, a cloistered community of Dominican nuns located just beyond Rome's city walls. But the reality, preserved in letters, confessionals, and the terrified testimonies of those who witnessed it, was far more explosive and infinitely more damaging to the Church's authority than any official history has been willing to acknowledge. Pope Leo X had inherited a church already fractured by scandal and weakened by the accumulated weight of corruption that had characterized the papacy for generations. His predecessors had openly sold indulgences to finance their wars, maintained mistresses with scandalous openness, and conducted the business of faith with all the moral seriousness that a Florentine banker might apply to accounting. Leo himself was no spiritual reformer. He was a Renaissance prince who happened to wear the triple tiara, a man more comfortable with classical literature and the patronage of artists than with the rigorous demands of ecclesiastical authority. From his earliest days as cardinal, Leo had demonstrated an appetite for pleasure that went far beyond what the Church's official teachings would consider appropriate. He kept a menagerie of exotic animals in his private chambers, including lions and panthers imported at considerable expense from North Africa, hosted elaborate banquets where the wine flowed freely and the conversation turned to pagan philosophers rather than the Church Fathers, and surrounded himself with young, attractive men whose primary function seemed to be companionship rather than any administrative duty. These attendants, invariably chosen for their beauty and wit rather than any clerical qualifications, accompanied him on his travels through Rome and the papal territories, their presence a constant source of gossip among both the clergy and the secular nobility. When he ascended to the papacy in 1513 at the remarkably young age of 37, few who knew him harboured any serious illusions that they had elected a saint to lead the Church. The cardinals who had voted for him had done so for pragmatic reasons, recognizing in the young Medici a man whose family connections and financial resources could be manipulated to their advantage, not because they believed him spiritually fit for the office. What they did not anticipate, however, was the brazenness with which Leo would pursue his private vices, while simultaneously accepting the spiritual authority that the office conferred upon him, as though the position itself could somehow sanctify behavior that would have been considered scandalous in a layman. The convent of San Marcelo, where this scandal would originate, was home to approximately 40 Dominican nuns who had devoted their lives to contemplative prayer and the service of God. The convent, built in the early 15th century with stones quarried from the Tiber Valley and decorated with frescoes by minor Renaissance artists, consisted of a series of interconnected buildings arranged around a central courtyard with a stone well at its centre, with high stone walls that separated the community from the distractions of the secular world beyond. The nuns were drawn primarily from Rome's aristocratic families, women who had either chosen a life of religious devotion or, more frequently, had been placed in the convent by families who saw in a veiled daughter a form of social respectability and financial economy, a way to maintain the family honour while avoiding the complications of arranging advantageous marriages for all their daughters. The Reverend Mother, a woman named Caterina Vitelli from one of Rome's prominent families with connections to both the papal court and to various noble houses, had governed the convent with what contemporary accounts describe as a combination of severity and surprising leniency, maintaining control through a careful calibration of reward and punishment. She maintained strict adherence to the rule of Saint Dominic in public, ensuring that observers and visiting ecclesiastical inspectors saw a community of austere, pious women devoted entirely to prayer and contemplation, their days structured around the canonical hours and their nights spent in silent dormitories under conditions of deliberate austerity. Yet behind the convent walls, especially in the smaller rooms away from the dormitories and chapel, in the infirmary and in the library's more remote corners, a different reality had gradually emerged over the course of several years as the sisters developed their own informal hierarchies and small rebellions against the constraints of their cloistered life. The story of how Leo's attention came to focus on the convent begins not with the Pope himself, but with one of his most trusted advisors, a cardinal named Marco Barbieri. Barbieri, a handsome man in his early 40s with a weakness for wine and women that was barely concealed behind ecclesiastical vestments, had frequent occasion to visit convents in his administrative capacity. It was during one such visit in the spring of 1516 that he encountered Sister Margarita, a nun in her mid-20s from the convent of San Marcelo. Contemporary accounts describe her as exceptionally beautiful, with the kind of delicate features that Renaissance artists idealized in their paintings of saints and Madonnas, and a voice so melodious that her singing during the convent's liturgical hours was noted as remarkably moving. Barbieri, scandalized neither by the woman's status as a bride of Christ nor by the vows she had taken, was struck immediately with what could only be described as infatuation. Within weeks, he had arranged for regular visits to the convent under the pretense of conducting ecclesiastical inspections. Within months, he had begun finding excuses to speak privately with Sister Margarita, conversations that moved gradually from discussions of theology to more intimate exchanges. It was Barbieri who, in the autumn of 1516, made the fateful decision to mention Sister Margarita to Leo X during one of their private meetings. The Pope, perpetually bored with the tedious machinery of ecclesiastical administration, found himself intrigued by Barbieri's descriptions of a woman who combined spiritual devotion with intellectual sophistication, a rare combination in that era. More significantly, Leo had recently been dealing with a series of political frustrations. His attempts to consolidate papal power in central Italy had been met with resistance from various factions of the nobility. His efforts to resolve the ongoing theological challenges posed by the growing Protestant movement had come to nothing, and the financial demands of maintaining the papal court and constructing St. Peter's Basilica had left him in constant irritation about the inadequacy of church revenues. In this state of mind, the idea of a secret liaison with a beautiful, intelligent nun held a certain appeal. It represented not merely pleasure, but a kind of rebellion, a private assertion of his freedom against the suffocating constraints of his official role. Arranging such a meeting required the coordination of multiple conspirators, each of whom participated for their own reasons and each of whom understood the extraordinary risks involved in facilitating such an arrangement. Barbieri played the role of intermediary, using his administrative authority to arrange for Sister Margarita to be temporarily reassigned to the convent's external duties, work that occasionally required trips to Rome for procurement of supplies and medicines that could not be obtained in the more remote hill towns where the convent stood. The Reverend Mother, Caterina Vitelli, was either ignorant of the arrangement or, more likely given later evidence that emerged during the subsequent investigations, had been subtly encouraged to approve it by promises of financial support for the convent and vague hints that her cooperation would lead to her own elevation to a more prestigious position within Rome's ecclesiastical hierarchy, perhaps even to leadership of a convent within the city itself, where she might exercise greater authority and enjoy more comfortable living conditions. A small group of papal servants and attendants who knew of Leo's interests arranged the logistics with the care that might be applied to military operations, ensuring that transportation was available, that trusted men guarded the routes, and that the meetings could occur in one of the Pope's private residences without drawing attention from the broader court or from the many factions within Rome's religious and political establishment who would have seized upon such information as a weapon. The first meeting between Leo and Margarita occurred in November of 1516 in a small villa that had belonged to the Medici family and now served as one of the Pope's private retreats outside the city proper, a place selected specifically for its remoteness and because it was surrounded by lands that Leo controlled, ensuring that there would be no unexpected visitors or curious observers. Contemporary accounts suggest that Leo, accustomed to easy conquest among those who understood the precariousness of their position relative to papal authority and the impossibility of refusing the advances of the most powerful man in Christendom, anticipated a simple seduction with minimal emotional complication. What he encountered instead was a woman of such complexity and intellectual engagement that the meeting lasted far longer than anticipated, the two engaging in conversations that moved from discussions of theology and church history into far more personal territory, exchanges that revealed Margarita's considerable education and her capacity for independent thought. What had begun as what Leo may have imagined would be a brief romantic escapade gradually evolved into something far more significant and, from the perspective of the Church's hierarchy, far more dangerous. Sister Margarita, for her part, was not simply a passive victim of papal seduction, though the power dynamics were undeniably overwhelming. According to confessional records that would later become evidence in the scandal, Margarita had long harbored doubts about her vocation, questions about whether she had truly chosen a life of religious devotion or had been placed in the convent more or less against her will by her family. Her encounters with Leo, conducted over the course of more than a year in various locations throughout Rome and the surrounding countryside, seem to have awakened in her a sense of genuine affection, complicated by her awareness of the impossible nature of their situation. The Pope, meanwhile, appears to have become increasingly infatuated, moving beyond simple physical attraction to genuine emotional engagement with Margarita in ways that extended beyond his other liaisons and indulgences. By the spring of 1517, rumors of an affair between the Pope and a nun from San Marcelo had begun circulating through Rome's sophisticated social circles. The city's ambassador networks, always eager for scandals that might embarrass the papacy, quickly caught wind of the story. A Venetian diplomat sent a coded letter back to the Doge describing whispered conversations in the marketplace about the Pope's visits to a beautiful nun outside the city walls. A Florentine merchant, apparently familiar with Barbieri, wrote to his brother describing in crude detail what he claimed to know about the liaison. These rumors, while not yet public knowledge in the broader sense, were known to the Cardinal's Council, to various members of the papal household, and to enough people in Rome's interconnected aristocratic circles that discretion was becoming increasingly impossible. What made the situation particularly explosive was that the affair had moved beyond merely physical intimacy into territory that threatened the fundamental doctrines of the Church itself. According to evidence that would later come to light, Leo had promised Margarita that he would arrange for her to leave her vows and that they would find a way to marry, or at least establish a permanent private arrangement. He had spoken to her of his profound doubts about the very foundations of priestly celibacy, a requirement that he had always found oppressive and that he seemed increasingly inclined to challenge. More dangerously, Margarita had become pregnant with Leo's child by the autumn of 1517, a fact that both of them initially attempted to conceal, but that became impossible to hide as winter progressed. The presence of an illegitimate papal heir would have been scandal enough. The fact that the mother was a professed nun transformed the situation into something that threatened to destabilize the entire theological framework upon which the Church's moral authority rested. If the Pope, the supposed vicar of Christ on earth, the living embodiment of spiritual perfection, could openly violate vows of celibacy and seduce women consecrated to God, then what did that say about the Church's claims to moral superiority? What ground did they have to demand celibacy from their priests if the Pope himself rejected it? By January of 1518, the situation had deteriorated into something approaching crisis. Margarita, now visibly pregnant and desperate with fear about what would become of her and her unborn child, had begun confiding details of her relationship with Leo to other nuns in the convent, seeking both emotional support and advice. Word spread through the Dominican convents of Rome and eventually began filtering out into the broader religious community. A number of bishops became aware of the situation. At least one wrote coded letters to church officials in other cities expressing grave concerns about the implications. The Pope's own cardinals, particularly those who had never fully accepted Leo's leadership or who represented rival factions within the church hierarchy, saw in the scandal an opportunity to undermine his authority. Cardinal Raffaele Riario, who had opposed Leo's election and represented the interests of those who wished to see a more austere pontiff, began quietly investigating the affair and gathering documentation of what had transpired. The Pope, meanwhile, had shifted into something approaching panic. the man who had been so cavalier about his indulgences and so unconcerned with maintaining appearances, now faced the possibility of his authority being permanently shattered by public revelation of his hypocrisy. He began making frantic arrangements to contain the damage. Margarita, now terrified and desperate, was moved from the convent of San Marcelo to a more isolated facility in the Apennine Mountains, ostensibly for reasons of health, but actually to separate her from the other nuns and remove her from Rome, where the gossip was becoming harder to control. Leo provided generous financial support, ensuring that she would have the best possible care, but also ensuring that she remained dependent on him and unable to speak publicly without destroying herself economically. The child, born in March of 1518, was quickly removed from Margarita and placed in the care of a trusted family loyal to the Medici, where the infant would be raised with the understanding that its paternity must never be publicly acknowledged. The Pope attempted to use his authority to suppress discussion of the affair, threatening cardinals who spoke too openly about it with isolation from the centers of power, hinting at investigations into their own moral behavior that might reveal compromising information. Several prelates who had been most vocal about the scandal suddenly became silent, either out of fear or as a result of arrangements made between their representatives and papal officials. Yet despite these efforts, the scandal could not be fully contained. Too many people knew about it or had heard credible rumors. The story had begun to take on a life of its own, growing more lurid and elaborate with each retelling. In Venice, the affair was described as evidence of widespread papal corruption. In Germany, Protestant Ref. Almost seized upon it as proof of the Church's fundamental spiritual bankruptcy. In Spain and France, diplomats sent detailed reports back to their monarchs describing the shocking behavior of Rome's head. The scandal began to damage Leo's political authority as well as his moral standing. His attempts to gather support for crusades against Protestant heresy found themselves undermined when people asked how the Pope could call Christians to holiness while he himself lived in open violation of church law. The Reverend Mother Caterina Vitelli, whose complicity in the affair had already been established among those in the know, found herself in an increasingly precarious position. She had presumably cooperated with the Pope's wishes in hopes of personal advancement, but the scandal threatened to destroy her instead. Leo, desperate to redirect blame away from himself, appears to have decided that Vitelli would serve as a convenient scapegoat. She was accused of having deliberately facilitated the improper relationship and was removed from her position as Reverend Mother in a process that took place behind closed ecclesiastical doors rather than in any public forum. The official explanation provided was that she had failed in her duties to maintain proper discipline within the convent, a technically truthful but deeply misleading characterization of her actual offences. She was reassigned to a minor convent in southern Italy, her authority stripped away and her reputation within church circles irreparably damaged. The other nuns of San Marcelo, including Sister Margarita herself before her removal, faced their own forms of punishment and complications as a result of the scandal. The investigation that had been initiated into the affairs of the convent under the pretense of ecclesiastical inspection became increasingly intrusive, with papal officials questioning every nun about their knowledge of improper relationships or moral failings. The convent's reputation was damaged, and it became difficult to attract new postulants or to maintain the community's reputation among Rome's aristocratic families. More devastatingly, the scandal created a climate of suspicion and paranoia within the convent walls. Nuns who had previously lived together in relative harmony and mutual trust now viewed each other with suspicion, wondering who had revealed information and who might be reporting to papal officials. The intimacy and sisterhood that should have characterized a contemplative community were replaced by the corrosive effects of fear and betrayal. Margarita herself lived out her days in that isolated convent in the mountains, separated from her child and from any possibility of public acknowledgement of her relationship with the Pope or of the offspring that had resulted from it. Contemporary accounts describe her as having declined physically and psychologically over the years, a woman who had experienced both elevation and complete destruction as a result of her brief liaison with the most powerful man in Christendom. She lived until 1541, dying at an age well beyond what was common for the era, but apparently without ever recovering from the trauma of her experiences. Her son grew up without ever knowing his true parentage, raised by a family that treated him with appropriate care, but who kept the secret of his origins locked away until after everyone involved had died. The long-term consequences of this scandal reverberated through both the Church and the broader political landscape of Renaissance Europe. The scandal had demonstrated in the most vivid possible way the fundamental hypocrisy that critics had long accused the Church of embodying. How could an institution that claimed spiritual authority, while its leaders so blatantly violated their own rules and doctrines, maintain credibility in matters of faith and morality? The scandal became part of the ammunition used by Protestant reformers in their attacks on papal authority. Martin Luther, who had begun his campaign against church corruption around this time, pointed to the Leo scandal as evidence that the church required fundamental reform, that the papacy itself was so corrupted that it could no longer be trusted to define Christian doctrine or practice. The affair contributed to the broader climate of religious skepticism and dissatisfaction that would eventually tear apart the Western Church during the Reformation. Yet perhaps most significantly, the scandal exposed the fundamental instability of the system of celibacy that the Church had enforced for centuries. Leo himself, despite his attempts to contain the damage from the scandal, seems to have been genuinely moved to reconsider his own support for mandatory celibacy. In private conversations recorded by courtiers, he had expressed his belief that celibacy was contrary to human nature and that the Church's insistence on it caused far more harm than good. Had Leo survived longer and had he possessed the political capital that the scandal had stripped away, he might have attempted significant reforms to the celibacy requirement. As it was, his authority had been sufficiently undermined that he could not push through such revolutionary changes. He would die in 1521, only 3 years after the scandal had begun to unfold, worn out by stress and illness, compounded by his futile attempts to navigate the treacherous politics of Renaissance Rome. The scandal of Leo X and the nun Margarita represents one of those historical moments where the deepest contradictions of an era are exposed in all their painful clarity. The gap between the Church's claimed spiritual authority and its actual moral practice had been starkly illuminated. The promise of celibacy and dedication to Christ that countless women had made when they entered convents like San Marcelo was revealed to be a promise that even the Pope himself did not truly believe in or support. The incident became a symbol of everything that critics were beginning to say about the institutional Church as the 16th century progressed, a symbol that would be invoked again and again as the case for reform became increasingly overwhelming. The way that authorities handled the aftermath of the scandal also revealed uncomfortable truths about power and accountability within hierarchical institutions. The Pope, the one person most responsible for the violation of sacred vows and the seduction of a consecrated woman, faced no meaningful punishment. He remained in office until his death, his authority intact despite the damage to his credibility. The Reverend Mother, who had been complicit but who had far less authority and autonomy in her decision-making, found her career destroyed. Margarita, the woman who had the least power to refuse or resist, bore the most devastating personal consequences. This imbalance in accountability, where those with power face minimal consequences, while those with less power face severe punishment, emerged as a defining pattern of how institutions protect their leaders at the expense of more vulnerable members. The intellectual and spiritual impact of the scandal extended beyond immediate religious controversies into broader questions about the nature of faith and authority. If the Vicar of Christ could so openly violate the basic moral rules that the Church imposed on ordinary believers, what justified the Church's moral authority in the first place? On what grounds could the Church demand sexual restraint from lay people when its own leaders openly disregarded such requirements? These questions, implicit in the scandal, would become increasingly explicit as the 16th century progressed and the Protestant Reformation began to splinter the Western Church into competing factions, each claiming to represent the true Christian faith. The scandal had not caused the Reformation, but it had contributed to the intellectual climate that made Reformation seem not just desirable, but necessary. In the decades following Leo's death and the gradual fading of the scandal from public memory, the Church attempted to present itself as reformed and committed to greater moral rigor. The Council of Trent, which began in 1545, emphasized the need for clerical reform and attempted to address many of the abuses that critics had pointed to in previous centuries, including the scandal of Leo and Margarita. Yet despite these efforts, the fundamental contradictions exposed by that scandal would continue to haunt the institutional Church. The question of clerical celibacy in particular remained deeply contested throughout the Catholic Church's history, with many priests continuing to quietly violate their vows despite the official Church doctrine. The scandal thus becomes a lens through which we can observe the profound gap between institutional ideals and institutional reality, between the rules that institutions proclaim and the rules that their leaders actually follow. The blood-stained robes of a pope caught in his own moral failure seemed to echo down through the centuries, a reminder that even the highest authority is subject to human weakness and desire, that the sacred and the profane are often dangerously intertwined, and that the price of exposed hypocrisy is often paid most heavily by those with the least power to protect themselves.